Take that off. People like you do not deserve a name at my table. Ethan Whitmore's voice sliced through the glittering ballroom, sharp enough to silence 200 wealthy guests beneath the crystal chandeliers. A slow gasp rippled across the room as he grabbed the small name badge from Naomi Carter's black uniform and placed it on a silver tray beside untouched champagne glasses. The tiny piece of plastic clicked against the metal, impossibly loud in the frozen silence. Naomi did not reach for it. She simply lowered her eyes for a heartbeat, her fingers still wrapped around the serving tray that had suddenly become much heavier than it felt a second ago. Warm lights reflected across polished marble floors while a string quartet continued playing as if nothing had happened. No one moved. No one spoke. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances before quickly looking away. A waiter beside Naomi swallowed hard and stepped back, unwilling to become the next target. Ethan straightened the cuff of his tailored navy tuxedo without a hint of regret. Every movement was calm, polished, rehearsed. At 37, the youngest billionaire in New York had built a reputation for making impossible decisions without blinking. To him, weakness belonged outside the room. Naomi was simply another employee who had forgotten her place. "You interrupted a private conversation," he said, his voice low enough to force everyone to lean in. "That was your first mistake." Naomi lifted her eyes. They were steady, not angry, not frightened, simply clear. "Sir," she answered softly, "I only wanted to make sure you saw what was inside the folder before you signed anything tonight." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face, colder than the marble beneath their feet. "A maid giving financial advice?" Quiet laughter spread through the ballroom. Someone near the back muttered, "This should be interesting." Another whispered, "She will be lucky if she still has a job tomorrow." Naomi remained perfectly still. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with fresh roses and warm candle wax drifted through the air. Somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline. She glanced once toward the leather portfolio resting beside Ethan's crystal water glass. The edge of a blue document was barely visible beneath its cover. Her heartbeat quickened, but her expression never changed. "Please," she said. "Just read the first page." Ethan did not even look at the folder. Instead, he picked it up between two fingers as though it were something unpleasant. "You think I should trust a housekeeper over my board of directors?" More laughter followed, louder this time. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes pressing against her. Heat climbed into her cheeks, yet she refused to look away. Her grandmother had always told her that dignity was quiet, even when the world was loud. Ethan handed the folder to the head of security. "Escort Miss Carter out after the gala. She is finished here." The security officer hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before accepting it. Naomi inhaled slowly. She nodded once. "I understand." She placed the serving tray onto a nearby table with careful hands. Glass touched wood with a soft click. No trembling. No pleading. No tears. She turned toward the enormous front doors as rain began tapping against the towering windows. Behind her, the orchestra resumed its melody, guests returned to their conversations, and Ethan reached for the gold fountain pen waiting beside the contract. His fingers stopped only when the ballroom doors opened again without announcement. Cold night air swept inside, carrying the scent of rain across the room. Every head turned toward the entrance as an elegant elderly woman stepped through the doorway. The color drained from Ethan's face before she had spoken a single word. The ballroom fell so quiet that the rain outside became louder than the orchestra. Every crystal chandelier shimmered across the polished marble as Eleanor Whitmore stepped through the towering doors without waiting for an announcement. Her silver hair framed a face that carried effortless authority, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to command an entire room. Guests instinctively moved aside. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Ethan took one uneasy step forward. "Mother! I did not know you were coming." She never answered him. Her eyes were fixed on Naomi, who had almost reached the entrance. Eleanor's heels echoed across the marble floor, each measured step tightening the silence. Naomi slowly turned around, surprised. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed her face. Eleanor stopped only inches away and studied her carefully beneath the warm chandelier light. "Naomi?" she whispered. Naomi blinked. "Mrs. Whitmore." Before anyone could understand what was happening, Eleanor reached forward and gently held both of Naomi's hands. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Ethan stared, confused. His board members exchanged startled looks. One executive quietly muttered, "She knows the maid?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around Naomi's trembling hands. "You disappeared," she said, her voice shaking just enough for the closest guests to hear. "I searched for you." Naomi lowered her eyes. "I never wanted anything in return." Ethan frowned. "Mother, what is this?" Eleanor slowly turned toward her son. The disappointment in her eyes struck harder than any public criticism ever could. "Do you know who this young woman is?" Ethan forced a nervous smile. "She works for the event staff." Eleanor's expression never changed. "No." Another heavy silence settled across the ballroom. Outside, lightning flashed behind the tall windows, briefly washing the room in pale blue light. Naomi quietly pulled one hand free. "Mrs. Whitmore. Please. This is not necessary." Eleanor looked at her with unmistakable affection. "Necessary?" she repeated softly. "You stayed beside my hospital bed every evening after my surgery while everyone else believed I was asleep." Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Ethan's confidence began slipping. "Hospital?" he asked. Eleanor nodded without taking her eyes off Naomi. 5 years ago. The Rehabilitation Center in Connecticut. Naomi spoke almost in a whisper. "I was just cleaning rooms." Eleanor gently shook her head. "No. You were the only person who treated me like I was still human." The room grew even quieter. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass touched a table with a delicate clink that sounded impossibly loud. Ethan looked from his mother to Naomi, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Eleanor continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "Every evening you read to me because my eyesight had become too weak after surgery. You stayed long after your shift ended. You thought I never noticed." Naomi swallowed. "You needed company." "I needed hope," Eleanor corrected. "You gave me that when even my own family could not be there every night." Ethan felt warmth drain from his face. Memories flashed through his mind. Those months. Endless board meetings. International flights. Excuses about work. He had convinced himself he would visit tomorrow. Tomorrow had become weeks. Naomi quietly looked toward the exit again. "Mrs. Whitmore, none of this changes tonight." Eleanor followed her gaze. Then she noticed a leather portfolio resting beside Ethan's untouched contract. Her expression shifted instantly. "What was Naomi trying to show you?" Ethan hesitated. "It is probably nothing important." Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. "Please let it go." Eleanor slowly walked toward the table. The security chief still held the blue folder Ethan had refused to open. "Give it to me," she said. His hands hesitated before passing it over. Ethan stepped forward. "Mother, that can wait until after the gala." She ignored him completely. The room watched as she carefully opened the folder. Her eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. Her breathing slowed. The warmth vanished from her face. She looked up directly at Ethan, gripping the folder tightly enough for the pages to tremble. "Cancel the signing," she said quietly. "Right now." Every executive froze. Then Eleanor turned one final page, and the color completely disappeared from her face as she whispered, "Oh my God, it is someone already standing in this room." The words hit the ballroom harder than the thunder outside. Someone already standing in this room. Every conversation died instantly. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. A dozen phones quietly rose beneath the tables, their cameras glowing like tiny blue stars. Ethan Whitmore stepped toward his mother, forcing a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Mother, you are overreacting." Eleanor slowly closed the folder, but she did not let go of it. Her fingers tightened around the leather cover until her knuckles turned pale. Am I? She asked softly. The question floated through the ballroom like smoke. Ethan's chief financial officer, Richard Holloway, adjusted his silk tie and let out a controlled laugh. Mrs. Whitmore, with all respect, these are internal accounting documents. They can look alarming without context. Naomi, still standing near the grand entrance, finally looked directly at Richard. She had been silent for several minutes, yet something in her steady gaze made him look away first. Rain streamed down the towering windows behind her, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred streaks of silver and black. Eleanor noticed the exchange immediately. Naomi, she asked quietly, who were you trying to warn? Naomi hesitated. The silence stretched long enough for the humming air conditioning and the faint vibration of the catering refrigerators beyond the ballroom doors to become strangely loud. It does not matter anymore, she answered. Richard nodded quickly. Exactly. The gala should continue. Ethan looked relieved. Security, escort Miss Carter outside. Two guards exchanged uncertain glances but remained frozen. Nobody wanted to move while Eleanor Whitmore was still holding the folder. She slowly opened it again. Page 7, she whispered. Richard's smile disappeared for the smallest fraction of a second. Naomi saw it. So did Eleanor. Ethan did not. Read the highlighted paragraph, Naomi said calmly. Richard immediately interrupted. Those numbers are preliminary estimates. Naomi did not even look at him. Read them. Eleanor adjusted her glasses beneath the warm chandelier light. Her eyes scanned the page. Then another page. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Ethan wiped an invisible speck of dust from his cuff, but a thin layer of sweat had already formed around his wrist beneath the expensive watch he always wore with confidence. Eleanor raised her head slowly. These transfers, she murmured. Richard stepped forward. Completely authorized. Naomi finally took one careful step into the ballroom. The soft rubber soles of her work shoes barely made a sound against the marble, yet every guest followed her movement. No, she said. Only one signature appears to authorize them. Ethan frowned. Mine. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Richard folded his arms. She is guessing. Naomi looked at Ethan for the first time since he humiliated her. There was no anger in her eyes. Only disappointment. 3 weeks ago, your office printer jammed after midnight. I stayed behind to help maintenance clear the paper feed. Hundreds of discarded pages were left inside the recycling bin. Richard's breathing became noticeably slower. Naomi continued. I never searched for private documents. But one page fell onto the floor. She paused. The orchestra members sat perfectly still, bows hovering above silent strings. It contained your signature. Ethan frowned. That proves nothing. Naomi nodded again. Exactly. Until I noticed the signature on page 7. Eleanor's eyes widened. Richard shifted his weight. A tiny bead of sweat rolled from behind his ear despite the cool air inside the ballroom. Naomi spoke with quiet certainty. Your real signature always tilts upward at the last letter. Every legal document displayed in your office has the same pattern. Ethan instinctively looked toward the folder. Naomi continued before anyone else could speak. The signature authorizing those transfers tilts downward. It is almost perfect. Almost. Richard laughed again, but this time the sound cracked in the middle. You expect everyone here to believe a housekeeper became a handwriting expert? Naomi answered without raising her voice. No. I expect Mr. Whitmore to recognize his own name. Ethan reached toward the folder. Eleanor did not stop him. His eyes landed on the signature. He stared at it for several seconds. His confident posture slowly disappeared. Around him, guests leaned forward without realizing it. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures. Richard quietly loosened his tie. No one noticed him sliding one careful step toward the side exit until Naomi's calm voice cut through the silence. "If I were you," she said, never taking her eyes off him, "I would not leave before they checked the missing page hidden inside your briefcase." Richard Holloway froze. For one impossible second, the entire ballroom forgot to breathe. Then dozens of whispers burst across the room like sparks racing through dry leaves. Every glowing phone camera tilted toward him. The tiny red recording lights reflected across polished silver serving trays and mirrored columns. Richard forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow now. "This is absurd," he said. "You are taking financial accusations from a housekeeper." Ethan stepped between Naomi and his chief financial officer, his jaw locked so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his cheek. "That is enough," he said, his voice sharper than before. "You have embarrassed this family long enough." Naomi met his eyes without flinching. "I tried to stop this before anyone was embarrassed." Ethan looked away first. Eleanor noticed. So did everyone else. The room felt warmer despite the cold air flowing through hidden ceiling vents. Somewhere behind the ballroom walls, the giant refrigeration compressors vibrated with a low mechanical hum that seemed to echo beneath every heartbeat. Richard slowly adjusted his jacket. "If you wish," he said with practiced confidence, "security may inspect my briefcase immediately." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Ethan exhaled, almost relieved. "There," Richard continued. "Now everyone can see this ridiculous accusation end." Naomi remained perfectly still. "Do not open the main compartment," she said quietly. Richard's fingers stopped halfway to the lock. It lasted less than a second, but Eleanor caught it instantly. "Interesting," she whispered. Richard quickly recovered. "Why would that matter?" Naomi answered with the same calm voice. "Because the missing page is not there." Confused murmurs swept through the ballroom. Ethan frowned. "Then where is it?" Naomi looked toward the expensive leather handle instead of the zipper. "Inside the false lining behind the handle." Silence exploded through the room. Richard's face lost every trace of color. The security chief glanced at Ethan for permission. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to dismiss the accusation, but every eye in the ballroom was watching him now. His family's reputation hung in the silence. "Open it," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. Nobody questioned it. The security chief accepted the briefcase from Richard. Metal clasps clicked open beneath the chandelier light. Papers. Contracts. A tablet. Nothing unusual. Several executives began exchanging relieved smiles. Richard straightened his shoulders again. "Satisfied?" Naomi never moved. "The lining," she repeated. The security chief ran his fingers beneath the leather grip. Something felt uneven. His brow tightened. Carefully, he pressed against the stitching. A thin magnetic panel released with a faint snap. An envelope slid onto the marble floor. The sound was barely louder than a heartbeat, yet the entire ballroom gasped. Richard lunged one hurried step forward before stopping himself. Too late. Everyone had seen it. Ethan stared at the envelope as though it had appeared from nowhere. Eleanor slowly bent down and picked it up herself. The paper felt unusually thick. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a single signed authorization page along with several bank routing instructions. Her hands trembled. "No," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer. His breathing became shallow. His own signature stared back at him from the bottom of the page. The same downward tilt Naomi had noticed. Not his signature. A copy. Perfect enough to fool almost anyone. Almost. Richard shook his head desperately. "Someone planted those documents." No one answered. The silence itself rejected the excuse. Naomi finally spoke. "I told you the signature was wrong." Ethan looked at her as though seeing her for the very first time. His confidence had disappeared completely, replaced by something far more dangerous. Doubt. Across the ballroom, board members slowly began stepping away from Richard without realizing they were doing it. The invisible wall protecting him was collapsing. Then a sharp electronic chime shattered the silence. Every phone in Ethan's executive team lit up at the exact same moment. One by one, horrified faces stared down at identical breaking alerts flashing across their screens. Ethan pulled out his own phone. His eyes widened. The company's stock had begun crashing in real time. Eleanor slowly lowered the envelope, but Naomi was no longer looking at Richard. She was staring at the giant television mounted above the ballroom entrance, where the first live news broadcast had just interrupted the gala with one devastating headline. The television above the ballroom flickered once before a red breaking news banner swallowed the elegant charity logo. Every conversation died instantly. The only sounds left were the relentless rain against the glass, the steady hum of the climate system, and the endless chorus of phone cameras recording history as it unfolded. Whitmore Global under federal review following anonymous financial evidence, the anchor announced. Ethan Whitmore felt the blood drain from his face. His phone vibrated again. Then again. Then again. Investor alerts. Emergency board requests. Market losses climbing by the second. The stock graph plunged like a falling elevator. Around him, guests quietly stepped backward, creating an invisible circle of empty space that isolated him in the center of his own gala. Richard Holloway wiped his forehead with an expensive handkerchief, but his hands would not stop shaking. "This is coordinated," he snapped. "Someone leaked confidential information." His eyes locked onto Naomi. Her. Every head turned toward the black maid again. The pressure shifted in an instant. Whispering returned, louder than before. How would she know? Was she working with someone? Did she steal company files? Naomi stood perfectly still beneath the cold chandelier light. The white collar of her housekeeping uniform looked almost painfully plain among tuxedos and designer gowns. She suddenly appeared smaller than everyone around her, yet somehow she remained the calmest person in the room. Ethan looked directly at her, conflict tearing across his expression. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "Did you leak this?" Naomi answered immediately. "No." "Then how did this happen?" She hesitated. Just enough for doubt to spread through the crowd. Richard seized the moment. "She cannot answer because she planned this." Several investors nodded nervously. One woman slowly lowered her champagne glass without taking her eyes off Naomi. Eleanor Whitmore watched both of them in silence. She was no longer studying the documents. She was studying people. Their breathing. Their reactions. Their fear. Naomi quietly looked toward the television again. More headlines appeared beneath the anchor. Federal investigators. Suspicious transactions. Anonymous evidence package. Then her eyes narrowed. "No," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "What?" Naomi took one careful step toward the screen. "This is wrong." Richard almost laughed. "Still pretending to know more than everyone else?" Naomi ignored him completely. "Look at the timestamp." Ethan followed her gaze. The leaked documents had supposedly been received by investigators 43 minutes earlier. Naomi slowly shook her head. "That cannot be right." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Why not?" Naomi inhaled slowly. "Because I was holding those pages less than 20 minutes ago." The room froze again. Even Richard stopped breathing. Naomi pointed toward the television. "If investigators already had these documents 43 minutes ago," her voice became even quieter, "then the papers inside that briefcase are not the originals." Ethan stared at the envelope still resting in his mother's hands. The realization struck him with terrifying force. "Copies," he whispered. Naomi nodded once. "Someone wanted us to find them." Richard's confidence shattered. "That is impossible." Naomi turned toward him for the first time since the news broadcast began. "Is it?" The silence became unbearable. Every phone camera remained fixed on them. Every investor seemed afraid to blink. Outside, lightning flashed across the skyline, throwing pale reflections across the polished marble floor. Then another vibration rolled through the ballroom. This time it was not a phone. A deep mechanical rumble echoed from somewhere beneath the building. Glasses on nearby tables trembled softly. Several guests instinctively grabbed the backs of their chairs. Ethan looked toward the floor. "What was that?" No one answered. Naomi did. "The underground archive." Eleanor looked at her, startled. "How do you know about that?" Naomi swallowed hard. "Because when I cleaned the lower storage level yesterday, someone was already down there burning documents." Richard suddenly spun toward the side exit. Security reacted instantly, blocking his path. But Naomi was no longer watching him. Her eyes were fixed on the ballroom entrance where the elevator doors slid open with a metallic chime. 4 federal agents stepped into the room. Behind them walked a gray-haired woman carrying a sealed evidence case. She stopped the moment she saw Naomi. Her expression changed completely. Then, in front of every billionaire, investor, and reporter in the ballroom, she spoke the words that made Ethan's heart stop. "Miss Carter, we have been trying to find you all day." The words lingered in the ballroom long after the federal agent stopped speaking. "Miss Carter, we have been trying to find you all day." No one moved. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now, softened against the towering glass walls. The hidden air vents hummed gently overhead while dozens of phones continued recording, their tiny screens reflecting across polished silver and crystal. Naomi stood perfectly still. She did not smile. She did not look relieved. She simply closed her eyes for one slow breath before opening them again. Ethan Whitmore watched her with a confusion that had replaced every ounce of arrogance he had carried only minutes before. "You know them?" he asked, his voice lower than anyone had ever heard it. Naomi answered without looking at him. "I have never met them." The gray-haired federal investigator stepped closer, her leather case resting against her side. Her shoes echoed softly across the marble floor, each step measured, careful. "That is true," she said. "But we know who you are." A ripple of uncertainty spread through the guests. Richard Holloway remained frozen beside 2 security officers. For the first time that night, he looked smaller than his tailored suit. Eleanor Whitmore never took her eyes off Naomi. The investigator carefully opened the evidence case. No dramatic gesture. No raised voice. Only the quiet metallic click of 2 locks releasing into the silence. Inside rested a thin folder, several photographs, and one faded employee identification badge sealed inside a transparent evidence sleeve. Naomi's breathing slowed. Ethan leaned forward without realizing it. "What is that?" he whispered. The investigator lifted the badge between 2 fingers. The plastic had yellowed with age. The photograph showed a much younger Naomi wearing a navy blazer instead of a housekeeping uniform. Around her neck hung the same simple silver cross she still wore tonight. 6 years ago, the investigator said calmly, Miss Carter worked as a compliance analyst for a financial oversight contractor assigned to review nonprofit organizations receiving federal grants. The ballroom became impossibly still. Several executives blinked in disbelief. One investor quietly lowered his phone altogether. Ethan stared at Naomi as if the floor beneath him had disappeared. "Compliance?" he repeated. Naomi nodded once. "Before my grandmother became sick." No one laughed this time. The investigator placed another document onto the nearest table beneath the chandelier light. "She resigned voluntarily after becoming the full-time caregiver for her grandmother." Eleanor looked toward Naomi with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "You never told me." Naomi's answer came almost as a whisper. "Because it was never about me." Ethan swallowed hard. Every insult he had thrown at her replayed inside his mind with unbearable clarity. Housekeeper. Invisible. Stay in your place. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly beside the untouched contract. The investigator continued. "When our office received anonymous evidence this afternoon, one observation appeared repeatedly in every supporting note." She paused. Every guest leaned closer. The notes referenced a woman who noticed patterns everyone else ignored. Her eyes settled on Naomi again. "We believe the author was still inside this building." Naomi slowly shook her head. I did not send those documents. We know, the investigator replied. Your fingerprints are nowhere on the package. Richard closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Naomi noticed. So did Eleanor. Ethan followed Naomi's gaze toward Richard and suddenly understood something far more unsettling. If Naomi had not delivered the evidence, then someone else inside Whitmore Global had. Someone who knew everything. Someone still hidden. A cold silence settled across the ballroom. Even the mechanical hum beneath the building had faded, leaving only slow breathing and the occasional vibration of unattended phones. Naomi looked toward the dark windows overlooking Manhattan. Reflected in the glass, she noticed a figure standing near the service corridor behind the guests. A man in a maintenance jacket. He was not watching the agents. He was watching her. Their eyes met only through the reflection. Before Naomi could speak, he quietly touched the brim of his cap, turned, and disappeared into the shadows beyond the hallway. Naomi's expression changed for the first time all night. Eleanor saw it immediately. Naomi, she whispered. What did you just see? Naomi never answered. She was already staring at the empty corridor where the stranger had vanished, realizing the person who had started everything had just walked away unnoticed. Naomi never took her eyes off the empty service corridor. The silence stretched until it felt heavier than the marble beneath everyone's feet. Then she spoke, her voice calm enough to cut through the panic. He is not running away. Every head turned toward her again. Ethan Whitmore followed her gaze, his breathing shallow. Then what is he doing? Naomi answered without hesitation. Buying time. A low mechanical vibration rolled beneath the ballroom floor once more. Crystal glasses trembled almost imperceptibly. The federal investigator looked toward the hallway. What is below us? Ethan blinked. The secure archive, and the primary server room. Naomi nodded slowly. Exactly. Richard Holloway suddenly lifted his head. For the first time since the agents arrived, fear flashed openly across his face. Naomi saw it immediately. He is destroying the originals, she said. The ballroom erupted into overlapping whispers. Investors looked at one another in disbelief. Phone cameras followed Naomi instead of Ethan now. The invisible center of power inside the room had quietly shifted. Ethan stared at Naomi. How do you know? She looked at the ceiling for a brief second as another vibration echoed through the building. Listen. Everyone fell silent. Beneath the distant hum of ventilation came a rhythmic metallic pulse. Slow. Consistent. Mechanical. Naomi closed her eyes. That is not a paper shredder. The federal investigator frowned. What is it? Industrial backup drive spinning under maximum load. She opened her eyes again. Someone is copying everything before deleting it. The investigator immediately reached for her radio. Seal every exit below ground. Her agents rushed toward the elevators. Richard suddenly took one hurried step after them. Security blocked his path instantly. His carefully controlled smile was gone. Sweat glistened along his temples beneath the ballroom lights. Ethan looked from Richard to Naomi, realization crashing through him. You knew this was happening before anyone else. Naomi shook her head gently. No. Her answer surprised everyone. I only noticed things people stopped seeing. Eleanor watched Naomi with quiet admiration. Like what? Naomi glanced toward the untouched serving trays she had carried only an hour earlier. People who clean buildings notice sounds. She looked around the ballroom. Elevators. Ventilation. Backup generators. Every machine has its own rhythm. Another vibration rolled through the floor. Tonight that rhythm changed. The room became impossibly still. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Naomi continued, never raising her voice. Yesterday the server cooling units were already running much louder than normal, even though everyone had gone home. Ethan whispered almost to himself. The data transfer started yesterday. Naomi nodded once. Someone planned every minute of this. The federal investigator looked at Naomi with open respect now. You connected mechanical patterns to financial fraud. Naomi answered simply. No. I connected people to habits. Richard lowered his head. The confidence that had defined him all evening had completely vanished. Eleanor stepped beside Naomi instead of beside her son. The movement did not go unnoticed. Camera shutters exploded across the ballroom. One image after another captured the billionaire's mother standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman her own son had humiliated. Ethan saw every flash. Each one felt heavier than the last. He looked at Naomi, searching for anger, satisfaction, even revenge. He found none. She was still watching the service corridor. It is not over, she said quietly. The federal investigator's radio suddenly crackled to life. Control to Alpha Team, archive level is empty. A pause followed. Then another voice broke through, strained and breathless. Negative, correction, we found something. Every person in the ballroom stopped breathing. There is a sealed safety deposit cabinet hidden behind the backup servers. Naomi slowly closed her eyes. She already knew what was coming. The investigator pressed the radio closer. Open it. Static filled the silence for several endless seconds. Then the reply came. Ma'am. Inside the cabinet we found one handwritten letter. Another pause. It is addressed to Miss Naomi Carter. The ballroom remained frozen as the words echoed through the investigator's radio. It is addressed to Miss Naomi Carter. No one spoke. Even the dozens of glowing phone screens seemed suddenly insignificant. The quiet mechanical hum beneath the building had faded into the background, replaced by slow breathing and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the glass walls. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. She looked neither surprised nor triumphant. Only tired. The federal investigator accepted a sealed evidence envelope from the agent who had hurried into the ballroom moments later. White gloves carefully broke the security seal beneath the cold chandelier light. Every camera focused on Naomi's face instead of the envelope. Ethan Whitmore barely noticed. His attention never left the woman he had publicly humiliated less than an hour earlier. The investigator unfolded a single handwritten letter. The ink had faded slightly, but every line remained clear. She looked toward Naomi. May I? Naomi nodded once. Please. The investigator began reading. If anyone besides Naomi Carter finds this letter, then I have failed to stop what is coming. Naomi, if you are hearing these words, it means you noticed what everyone else ignored. I always believed you would. A ripple moved through the crowd. Ethan closed his eyes. The words landed heavier than any accusation. The investigator continued. You once told me that buildings speak before people do. That machines reveal fear long before faces admit it. You were right. Naomi looked quietly toward the marble floor. She remembered saying those words years ago during a late-night compliance inspection. She had almost forgotten the conversation herself. Eleanor slowly reached for Naomi's hand. This time Naomi did not pull away. I trusted your instincts more than any report. The investigator read. That is why only your name appears on this letter. If the truth survives, it will survive because you refuse to stop paying attention. Complete silence settled over the ballroom. Richard Holloway lowered his head. Even he could no longer look at Naomi. Investors who had questioned her only minutes earlier now watched with expressions of disbelief and quiet shame. One by one, phones that had been recording out of curiosity slowly lowered. The room no longer felt like spectators watching a scandal. It felt like witnesses watching an apology unfold without words. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat tightened. Every insult he had spoken replayed with unbearable clarity. Invisible. Stay in your place. People like you. Each sentence now echoed back at him louder than when he first said it. He stepped toward Naomi carefully, as though afraid the marble itself might reject him. Miss Carter. His voice cracked before he finished. Naomi looked up calmly. There was no bitterness in her eyes. Only compassion that somehow made his regret even heavier. Ethan struggled to continue. I judged you before I ever saw you. Naomi remained silent. The room waited. Eleanor looked at her son, tears shining beneath the chandelier light. Some mistakes cannot be erased, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. He turned back to Naomi. But everyone in this room deserves to know the truth. He faced the guests, the investors, the reporters, and the countless cameras now broadcasting every expression across the ballroom. His shoulders lowered. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. Tonight, he said quietly, the wisest person in this building was the one I treated as though she did not belong here. No one interrupted. Several executives looked down at the floor. Others quietly removed the glasses from their hands. The applause that usually followed powerful speeches never came. It would have felt wrong. Naomi simply stood there in her plain housekeeping uniform beneath the brilliant chandeliers, somehow appearing taller than anyone else in the room. She did not ask for recognition. She did not defend herself. She did not remind anyone that she had been right all along. Her silence carried more dignity than any victory speech ever could. Then the federal investigator carefully folded the letter again. She looked toward Naomi with a different expression now, one of deep respect mixed with quiet concern. There is one final page, she said softly. It was sealed separately. Naomi's peaceful expression faded almost imperceptibly. What does it say? The investigator looked down at the unopened page for a long moment before lifting her eyes again. It is not about the fraud, she whispered. It is about your grandmother. The room fell silent once more as Naomi's fingers slowly began to tremble for the very first time. Naomi looked at the unopened page without reaching for it. Around her, the ballroom had grown almost impossibly quiet. The refrigeration units beneath the building had settled into a faint whisper. The emergency alerts had stopped. Even the endless vibration of phones had faded into silence as guests slowly lowered their cameras. The federal investigator carefully unfolded the final page. Her voice softened. Miss Carter, your grandmother never wanted you to give up the career you loved because of her. 6 months before she passed away, she secretly contacted our office. Naomi closed her eyes. Her breathing caught for the first time that night. Eleanor gently tightened her hand around Naomi's. The investigator continued. She told us that if justice ever depended on your courage again, we should remind you of one sentence. The room waited. She said, tell Naomi that kindness is not the opposite of strength. It is the highest form of it. Tears gathered quietly in Naomi's eyes, but none fell. She smiled instead. A small, tired smile that carried years of sacrifice no one in the ballroom had ever bothered to imagine. Ethan lowered his head. Every polished marble wall, every crystal chandelier, every expensive watch and tailored suit suddenly felt meaningless beside the quiet dignity standing only a few feet away. He took one careful step forward. Then another. Finally he stopped in front of Naomi. There was no audience left in his mind, no investors, no cameras, no reporters. Only the woman he had failed to see. Miss Carter, he said, almost in a whisper, I cannot change what I said to you tonight. Naomi looked at him calmly. No, she answered. You cannot. He nodded once. But I can choose who I become after tonight. She studied him for a long moment before offering the smallest nod in return. It was not forgiveness given lightly. It was something quieter. A chance to become better. Eleanor reached down to the silver tray where Naomi's plastic name badge still rested exactly where Ethan had thrown it. She picked it up carefully, brushed away a single drop of spilled champagne, and walked back toward Naomi. Without saying a word, she pinned the badge back onto Naomi's uniform with gentle hands. The tiny click echoed softly through the silent ballroom. No applause followed. None was needed. Several executives slowly removed their own event badges, looking at them differently now. Investors who had once refused to meet Naomi's eyes quietly stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the ballroom doors. Not because she was powerful. Because she had earned their respect. The federal agents escorted Richard Holloway away without another word. He never looked back. Outside, the storm had passed. Pale morning light slipped through the towering windows, washing the marble floor in warm gold instead of cold white. The city beyond the glass seemed strangely new. Ethan watched Naomi pick up the same serving tray she had carried before everything changed. It was lighter now, though nothing about it had changed except the people looking at it. She started walking toward the exit. Ethan instinctively moved to open the enormous ballroom doors before she reached them. He held them without speaking. Naomi paused beside him. "Thank you?" she said quietly. "No," Ethan replied, his eyes lowered with quiet humility. "Thank you for refusing to become the person I expected." Naomi stepped into the morning sunlight. The cool breeze carried away the last traces of the night's tension. Behind her, no one called her back. No one tried to stop her. They simply watched in respectful silence as the woman they had mistaken for invisible walked into the dawn with her head held high. The ballroom remained still long after she disappeared from view. On the polished silver tray resting near the doorway, the first rays of sunlight reflected off a tiny plastic name badge that now seemed brighter than every crystal chandelier in the room.